I mean, not a different order. Anyway, let's see here. So some of this stuff is kind of presented in a book, or it is presented in a book that I recently read by a friend of mine. Actually, I met Ben at a conference. I met him at a couple of conferences. I've known him for a while, but he's a young guy, young scholar, New Testament scholar, and he wrote a book called 10 Reasons You Can Trust the New Testament. So if you really want to go deeper, well, actually, it's called 13 arguments, but we're only going to do 10 tonight. I don't have time to do the last three. And to be honest, I think the 10 of them are good enough. But if you want to get the whole book, you can get it. It's not that long to read. I think it's only about 160 pages. So you can get it. It's kind of a thin book on InterVarsity Press, but it's a nice little book. It's concise. It's puts together all the arguments nicely in a nice succinct, a nice format. So I think that you'd like that book. If you're looking for a book just kind of compiles it all together, I think this is a good book to give to others or just for yourself. Okay. So Ben has listed some of these, and I'm gonna elaborate on them. Some of them we have mentioned before. It's not that we've never mentioned them, but we'll just kind of do these in order. Now, of course, the New Testament contains the information about Jesus. So if we want to tell others about Jesus or talk about his deity or talk about anything about him, we know that the primary documents we have for them are in the New Testament. So if you can't trust the New Testament, it's going to be hard to talk about Jesus. Some people have been talking about these questions for years, but you run into somebody that really has questions. This might, some of these things might come up, or maybe they already have. So anyway, I hope they help. So the first thing Ben talks about is the textual evidence. And the question is whether our New Testaments contain the words as they were originally written. Sometimes we hear people that think the Bible's been changed or the New Testament's been changed. It's been changed, it gets copied, and it's written by man and there's mistakes and you can't trust it. And, it's just hopelessly corrupted or something. Sometimes I have Muslims tell me in conversations with them, they say the Bible's been corrupted, and I ask them where it's been corrupted, and they can't give me an answer. So this is important. So it's not like it's irrelevant. Now, remember that we're talking about the New Testament, actually the Old Testament too, but the New Testament, we don't have the original manuscripts, like the very manuscripts that whatever, the very first manuscripts, that we have copies. Okay. And so we don't have the original autographs. Okay. That's why sometimes you might see arguments for what's called biblical inerrancy. They will say the only things that are inerrant are the originals. Okay. We don't have the originals. We have copies. Okay. So even though we only have copies, we have a lot of them, an awful lot of them. We have more copies of the New Testament than anything else in the ancient world. So what textual critics do, these guys, they do what's called textual criticism. They come along, they take all these copies we have and they compare them to each other. Okay. And so we have a lot, as I'll show in a little chart here. We have compared to other ancient writings. As you can see, we have more New Testament manuscripts than any other writing in the ancient world. You can see we have even more than Homer, okay, or any of these other ones. And we also have a shorter time span, for when we have the copies, like from when they're originally written. Look at Homer, you only have 643 copies and they come 500 years later. So the reason that's important is because the more copies, the better, the more the textual critics can compare them to each other to see if what's different or if there's some sort of spelling error or something. But I mean, we have copies, okay? And as I said, we have about 5,700 more Greek and partial manuscripts of the New Testament. Okay. Um, and all the language, in all languages, Greek and non-Greek, we have a total of 25,000. So the New Testament has more manuscripts than any other book of ancient history. Okay. And that's one of the earliest ones right there. But what happens is, what that means is that, let's skip that. That's all right. What happens is when we have more copies, it's good because the textual critics can compare them, but because we have so many copies, you would expect there's going to be some small differences in them. Okay. Remember that the way the scribe is copying the New Testament, it's not like God is emptying their mind, okay, and they're just like a typewriter. They're not like taking dictation, okay. It's not like they're sitting there like with a hand that's not really theirs, and God's controlling their hand, right? That's not the way that it was copied, okay. And so there are some spelling errors and some things that stand out are some things in the manuscripts that they find. They find some words missing, or like a letter missing, or um, they're not copied perfectly. Like some of them look better than others, but some of them are missing. There's some scribal errors, okay, because or we don't call them errors or just mistakes, but they're nothing significant. But see, when we have over 5,700 manuscripts, they can compare them to each other. Okay, now see that middle bracket there with the arrows right there. That's the original manuscripts. We don't have those. Okay, we don't have the original autographs. We have copies, like copy 1, copy 2, copy 3, copy 4. So they can compare these. The texture critics compare them to each other. And then sometimes they come along. Sometimes what happens is they have a variant. Okay, now a variant is when manuscripts are compared, and it's discovered that one manuscript says one thing, another manuscript says something different. So these differences in the manuscripts are called what we call textual variants. Okay, sometimes the variants appear what called variant units. Okay, now it's not that big a deal, but I mean the things they find. This guy right here, who's actually more of an agnostic and atheist, but he's a textual critic, and he believes Jesus died, rose from or he believes Jesus died as a real person. He just doesn't believe he rose from the dead. If you go to school in North Carolina, or a lot of colleges, if you take an intro to Christianity class, or New Testament, intro to New Testament or anything, you'd read one of his textbooks. He has a textbook a lot of people use. But he admits that yeah, we have. Here's what he says here. He says, textual scholars have enjoyed reasonable success at establishing the best of their abilities the original text of the New Testament. Indeed, barring extraordinary new discoveries of phenomenal alterations of method, it is virtually inconceivable that the character of our printed Greek New Testaments will ever change significantly. Okay, so that's what he says. He talks about textual critics. They come along and they reconstruct the text, okay, and they compare the differences. And Dan Wallace, he's another New Testament critic. He teaches at Dallas Seminary. I think he's retired now. He has an entire website. If you go to his website, it's called, like, I think, Greek manuscripts or New Testament manuscripts. Just type in Dan Wallace New Testament manuscripts. He's one of the foremost experts on this topic. He says here, regarding various differences between texts, Wallace writes, no viable variant affects any cardinal of the New Testament. The text is certain in all its essentials, and even the most particulars we can be relatively sure what the autograph said. Further, in the passages in which the text is in doubt, no cardinal doctrine is at stake. So he's saying basically whatever the differences are in the autographs, whether they be spelling errors or words missing or something, he said doesn't affect any major Christian doctrine, nothing major. And this is a good quote by a guy named D.A. Carson. He's been around forever. He's a New Testament scholar. He says, of the 20,000 lines in the New Testament, only 40 are contested, about 400 words. The rest just given over 99.5 transmission accuracy, none affect any major doctrine. So he says here, the Bible's been translated, recopied so many times is really quite uninformed. When someone comes to you and says, the Bible's been translated, recopied, that's just kind of a misunderstanding. And he says here, the purity of the text is of such a substantial nature that nothing we believe to be true, nothing we're commanded to do is in any way jeopardized by the variant readings, okay? The variants, once again, remember I said that earlier? I just said that a minute ago. That's a variant, right? A variant is when one manuscript says one thing, another manuscript says something different. Okay, they're called textual variants. Okay, and he's saying that nothing in the variants really affect any major Christian doctrine. Okay, same with D.A. Carson. Now, so as I said, we don't have the original manuscripts of the New Testament. For some reason, God has decided not to let us find them, and maybe it's good. Maybe we would worship them. I don't know. Maybe they'd be idolized. I don't know. But the original text contained in those manuscripts has been remarkably preserved. Okay, and so as I said, the original text may be reconstructed from the readings present in the thousands of manuscripts known today. No serious question remains about the original text of the vast majority of words in the New Testament. Now, when you take the Quran, Muslims believe that Allah dictated the Quran through the angel Gabriel to Muhammad. Okay, and so Muhammad went away and he was told to recite what he heard, and he couldn't write. And so he recited it to some other people. And then those people supposedly wrote it down. And then we have the Quran today. Now, of course, he orally transmitted it at first and then they wrote it down. But there's a lot of debate how we got the Quran. I mean, but if you talk to Muslims, they think it almost just fell out of the sky. And they make it sound like Allah just handed Muhammad the Quran and there was no editing, nothing. There was no changes or anything. And they make it sound more like a dictation theory that Allah transmitted, he like emptied the mind of Muhammad and just, gave him this full revelation. Okay. And that's not what we believe about the Bible. See, we believe in the human element in God. We believe it's inspired by God. We also believe he uses humans, right? He uses their personalities, their backgrounds, their culture to write the Bible. That's why you see so many different cultural things in the Bible, right? Different people that are aware of their culture, you can tell they know what's going on in their culture and they write it. You can just tell it reflects in the Bible. So, but that's a little different as view as the transmission of the Quran. Now, Muslims will also say, if you ever talk to them, that the Quran has been perfectly preserved. Okay, that there's been no changes, nothing. There's no, like, when we go back here to variants, we have variants. They would say something like this doesn't exist in the Quran, like it's perfect, like there's no spelling changes or no words missing or anything like that. It's just perfectly intact, okay? Which simply is not true at all. But the point is that even if you have a ton of early manuscripts and you argue that the Quran's been perfectly preserved, no, not one single change, nothing, even minor changes like spelling issues or anything, it really doesn't matter, because even if that was true, which it's not, it doesn't mean what's in the Quran is actually true. The content of the Quran, what's in it, the claims, because the Quran says Jesus never died. Okay, they don't believe Jesus ever died on a cross. So that means that it doesn't matter how well it's preserved. What's in it is false. Okay. For example, if you had the Mormon church, you have Joseph Smith, who supposedly founded the Mormon church. If we had all these early manuscripts of the Book of Mormon and they were all preserved perfectly, if we discovered that there hasn't been any spelling errors or any small changes or anything like that, that would still not make Mormonism true, because the content in the Book of Mormon is false. The actual content itself, okay? Because there's no archaeological evidence in the Book of Mormon, nothing, okay? So whenever you talk to somebody and they argue how their book's been perfectly preserved, that's good. It's not a bad thing, but that doesn't mean what's in it is true. That's why when we argue for the New Testament being preserved, we don't make that just the only argument. we have to argue, we have to give good reasons for why what's in the New Testament is actually true, the actual content. Okay. All right. Second thing Ben brings up is the genre issues. And what that means is, what kind of literature are the Gospels? Like, what are we reading? What should we expect? Because like when we read the book of Revelation, that's what we call apocalyptic literature. When we read the Psalms, we know that's poetry. When you read Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, we know that's wisdom literature. So we have these different genres of the Bible, right? Well, what about the New Testament? Well, the Gospels themselves are a form. Now, Paul's letters, those are letters, right? They're not biographies. But you have the Gospels, they're a form of ancient biography. Okay, not modern biography, but they're ancient biography. Okay, and they contain the words and deeds of a historical person, just like, of course, that's about Jesus. So the way the kind of literature they're not like fantasy or like fiction. Okay, they're not like fanciful novels. And this is a really good quote by Craig Blomberg. He says, "Can we speak of the Gospels as biographies? If by that we mean modern Western biographies, of course not. Jesus lived in the Middle East and not in the West, and he lived long before the modern era. It'd be sheer anachronism and a monstrous injustice to evaluate Matthew, Mark, Luke by 21st century standards of precision, some of which they probably could never imagine." So that's important because the biographies of the Gospels are ancient biographies. They're not Western modern biographies. Okay, they came together in the Middle East, and they if you look at ancient biographies of other people at that time, there are some similarities and differences. Like they both focus on the life of a single person, right? Whether that person be Josephus, he was a Jewish historian, or Alexander the Great, or somebody. But this ancient biography, of course, these ancient biographies about Jesus, right? They focus on a single person, right? And then you have the biographies broken down, ancient biographies broken down to three main parts: the birth, public life, and death of the person. That's the way a lot of ancient biographies are. They focus on those three areas. They're not necessarily like a chronological account of a person's life. They don't put everything in there. As you notice, when you read the Gospels, they don't talk about Jesus's childhood a lot. That's because that biographer, and the fact that they're ancient biographies, that's not a big concern. Okay, they want to devote more of their time to the birth, the public life, and then the death of the person. So their teenage years or early years are not really that important in an ancient biography. So anyways, the Gospels are also, I don't know if you've noticed, they're a form of testimony. That's Richard Bauckham talks about that in his book, The Gospels Eyewitness Testimony. They are the disciples testifying to what they saw and heard, right? It was a high impact event, just like 9/11 to you guys. You can remember where you were on 9/11, the day it happened. High impact events will leave a memory. I mean, it will burn in your memory for decades and decades later. You can probably remember it, write it down. The Gospels are a form of testimony. Okay, these authors are testifying to what they saw and heard about Jesus, right? So of course they're a form of testimony. All right. Okay. Third thing Ben talks about is the dating of the New Testament. When were these books written? Okay, because obviously you want the earliest documents you can have. You want events that are reported closer to the time they took place, right? Versus than way, way later. When you have the Quran that comes 600 years later after Jesus, and the Quran says Jesus never died, then, obviously that's way too late. 600 years later is just too late to trust anything about Jesus. And so when you can't do that. I mean, you're not gonna be able to trust that book because it's 600-700 years later, right? But you have the New Testament documents are much earlier, And when you look at the timeline, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. You have all of Paul's letters written before that, all of them written before probably 65 AD. And then you have the Gospels, probably dating, as I'll show you some dating, ranging from 60 to 70 AD. Then you have John's Gospel, it comes after 70 AD, probably about 80 to 90 AD. But the earliest records we have for Jesus, or talks about Jesus, of course, are Paul's letters, because Paul received all that information back between 30 and 40 AD, because he came to faith between 30 and 40 AD. Jesus died in 33 AD, and Paul received that information right after that. Then he wrote things in his letters, right? And Paul's letters are the earliest records we have for Jesus. Now, as I said before, I've showed you this chart. They're not biographies. They're letters. They're written to certain audiences. They're certain congregations, right, and communities. But Paul does mention things about Jesus in those letters, talks about biographical details. But those are written more from 47 to 65 AD, around that range, or 70, okay? So those are the earliest things we have about Jesus are written in Paul. Now, if you look at the dating of the Gospels, you kind of have conservative scholars and liberal scholars, of course. The conservative scholars date, Matthew between 60 and probably 80 AD, probably 70 AD. Then you have Mark is the earliest, probably 50 to 60 AD. Luke is dated somewhere between the 60s and 80s, and John probably 60 to 90, probably 80 to 90. And then you have the liberal scholars who don't believe Jesus is the Son of God or he rose from the dead. They have a very anti-supernatural bias towards the New Testament. They date the Gospels, everything later. But here's the thing you have to remember is that it really doesn't matter if the Gospels are written 3 decades after Jesus or whatever it is, even 3 to 4 decades. It doesn't really matter, because Jesus, their experience with Jesus was a high impact event, just like World War II veterans and people from the Holocaust testify what happened like 4 or 5, 6 decades later, right? They remember with great detail. Like I've said before, my sister passed away in 1974. I can remember every detail of that day. Okay, think how long ago that was. I can remember every detail. So it doesn't really matter if it's 3 or 4 decades later. They can remember things with great accuracy. Okay, and Jesus was a high impact person, a high impact event. Furthermore, as I said, Paul's letters are dated even earlier. So you have earlier sources or things about Jesus even before the Gospels. Okay. Okay. Now, then we have like New Testament authorship, like who wrote the different books of the New Testament. It'd be better to have sources that are written by those involved in the events or those who knew the ones involved. True. Some say that because the 4 Gospels don't have their names on them, it doesn't say at the beginning, like, this is written by Matthew, or this is written by Luke, or this is written by Mark, or, they sometimes say, we don't really know who wrote them. They just put their name, they just put these names on there. They just attached these names on the Gospels and the Gospels, but we don't really know if they really wrote them. So that's unfortunate. But there's a reason why the gospel authors don't mention their names in the Gospels. Part of it's just, once again, the type of literature they're writing. In ancient biographies, they don't do that in ancient biographies, because if you ever read Plutarch's biographies, he was a contemporary of Jesus. We have more than 60 biographies of him that he wrote. About 50 of the 60, we can look at about 50 of the 60 biographies he wrote. But his name is absent from all the biographies. His name isn't even on them. So it's just true that many authors, the way they wrote in that time period, they didn't attach their name to them, okay? But, most modern historians don't doubt that Plutarch wrote them. They don't come along and say, well, Plutarch didn't write them. We don't know, because he didn't put his name on them. They only seem to try to attach that to the 4 Gospels of Jesus, but that's inconsistent. Now, when you look at all the ancient manuscripts, all the way starting the 2nd century and on, right? They all have the names of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay. So there's absolutely no manuscript evidence to support the fact that these gospels weren't written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay. So if someone wanted to come along and make up Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as names, why make up those names? Why they come up with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Okay. But we have tons of manuscripts, and these manuscripts all attest to the fact that the original authors are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, that's all we can go off of, really. We have all these manuscripts. Okay, so that's kind of a silly argument that people give. Also, when you think about eyewitnesses, when you talk about whether the gospel authors are eyewitnesses, you have to look at whether some of them are what we call direct eyewitnesses. That means that they experienced the event themselves. They were a participant in the event. And then you have what's called indirect eyewitnesses. Now, indirect eyewitnesses, they didn't see everything or experience it. What they do is they get all their information from the direct eyewitness. Okay, they go to one of the direct eyewitnesses, and the direct eyewitness tells them everything they saw. Okay, but the indirect eyewitness is still living at that time period. They don't have firsthand knowledge of the event, but they could speak from the knowledge they get from the direct eyewitnesses. That's what they do. They get taught to them. For example, if you look at Luke, you look at the beginning of Luke, autopsy is the word we get for eyewitness. He says he's not a direct eyewitness of the events recorded in his gospel. He said that he's an eyewitness. He's recording the events. He said he used the personal information from those who were from the beginning, were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, right? He gets all his information from them. Okay, and so Luke says it right there in Luke 1. It says, I've written these things down, orderly account, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I've received these things from those who were from the beginning, were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. So Luke's not a direct eyewitness. He's an indirect eyewitness. And then you have Mark, and Mark relies on Peter as a direct eyewitness, because if you notice, Mark talks about a lot of things that Peter could only know. But really, Mark's gospel is really using Peter to communicate its information. Okay. And then John claims to be a direct eyewitness, right? So he says that in John 21:20-24. And then Matthew doesn't really say I'm a direct eyewitness. He doesn't say that. But as a tax collector, we know that in the book of Matthew, he makes a lot of references to money. Okay. And so if he's going to make all these references to money, he must have had some sort of eyewitness account of the ministry of Jesus. So you have direct eyewitnesses and what we call indirect eyewitnesses. Okay. Matthew's also, very familiar with geography and Jewish customs, Jewish history. Knows a lot about the Old Testament. Okay. Yeah. So anyway, so John, even though it says here, like, by the way, in John 21:24, it doesn't say John. He says, this disciple whom Jesus loved is the disciple who testifies to these things and wrote them down. We know his testimony is true. It doesn't really, I don't think that, John's trying to create mystery here, but obviously he's the same one who's one of the original 12, right? The original 12 disciples. Okay. Now there's a fifth thing called New Testament creedal traditions. This is kind of interesting. Creedal traditions are short sayings in the New Testament. They're not talking about like the Nicene Creed or anything 4th century. We're talking about in the New Testament themselves. There's little creedal statements that could be memorized orally before the New Testament was actually written. Okay? These are little creedal statements that if you're passing on the teachings of passing on what you want to teach about Jesus, these things can be passed on orally. Okay, they can be memorized and they're very early. Okay, for example, or the reason the reason they use creeds is to remind their audience, the teachings, traditions they had received orally, and to confirm the author's written word against such previously received proclamations. So, an example of some creeds in the New Testament would be 1 Corinthians 15:3-8, and 1 Corinthians 11:23. I'll show you some of them right now. Like this is a creed right here, and Paul received this information orally. He says here, "What I received, I passed on to you as first importance, that the Messiah died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried. He was raised according to the third day according to the Scriptures." So that is a creed, a creedal statement. And the rest of it, actually, the whole part there, 1 Corinthians 3-8, is really a creedal statement if you read the whole thing. So Paul is passing on what he received. He received this information from most likely Peter when he was in Galatia, and he's passing on what the central teaching is about Jesus. But this is something they can memorize and this is written way before the Gospels. It was communicated way before the Gospels even written. So this teaching could be memorized and passed on. Similar one is like 1 Corinthians 11, same thing, where Paul says, "For what I received from the Lord, what I also passed on to you, the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.'" So it's similar. Paul is saying, "I received this teaching. This is actually from Jesus himself, and I'm passing on to you that, this is the core teaching about Jesus." Okay. And then you have a couple in Romans. These are short statements that can be memorized and passed on about Jesus being the descendant of David, being the Son of God, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have another one in Romans 10:9, where it says, "If you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart God raised him from the dead, you will be saved." That's an easy creedal statement to pass on. It's not long. Remember, Jews memorized a lot of information. They memorized a lot of the Old Testament. It was a very oral culture. So these things can be passed on, and they're very early, and they're written before the Gospels. And so not hard to pass these on to the community around you. Number 6, have any material remains survive that affect our understanding of the New Testament? Have there been any archaeological findings that challenge the New Testament? Because when you have archaeological evidence, that shows that the New Testament authors are writing history, right? This isn't fiction. These are real historical events, real places, real people. And yeah, we have a lot of archaeology of the New Testament. I can't even show it all. There's so much. I'll just show some of them. But we have over 30 people in the New Testament been cited by non-Christian writers and confirmed by archaeological research. I'll show you some of them. There have been over 60 confirmed historical details in the Gospel of John. This is in a book by Craig Blomberg, Historical Reliability of John's Gospel. There have been over 80 confirmed historical details in the book of Acts. That was discussed in a book that came out a ways back called The Book of Acts and the Setting of Hellenistic History. You have all these people right here that are real people that have been confirmed in archaeology. Roman emperors, these are all people in the New Testament that, it's been confirmed. Yes, they existed. Yes, they were real. But they all are in the New Testament. Okay. You have other things as well. We had the Caiaphas ossuary. An ossuary is a bone box that Jews would bury their families in here. They'd all be buried in one box. They found a ton of these in Israel, I think in the 1980s. Ton of bone boxes. Jews are very interested in proper burial, so that when they put all their bones, they'd have all the bones of their family put in one box. But they found the Caiaphas ossuary. I don't know if you guys remember Mark chapter 14 or Matthew 26. Caiaphas was the one who was one of the Sanhedrin at Jesus's trial scene with the Sanhedrin. Um, so they found his bone box, his family tomb bone box. That's the guy that was at the Sanhedrin trial. So he actually ordered that Jesus be put to death. He was involved in that. Handed over the Romans, right? He was kind of, remember that Jewish trial was before the Roman trial. Then you had the Yohanan crucifixion victim found in 1968. They found the crucifixion victim that showed that Roman crucifixions did happen just the way it's recorded in the New Testament, with the spikes through the heels and through the hands. And that confirmed that Romans practiced crucifixion in the first century. Once again, this isn't Jesus. This is a victim they found called Yohanan ben Hagol. They found him in an ossuary, just like this ossuary back here. They found this victim in an ossuary. They found this. So they found the crucifixion, or the nail still in there. Okay. Then we found Jacob's well. This is the one that's discussed in John chapter 4. I think I saw that went to Israel. I don't remember. Maybe I didn't see that one. But anyway, that was found for the book of John. Obviously, we have found tons of stuff, the remains of what Herod the Great did. I saw all this stuff when I was in Israel. I went to that place in Caesarea. I saw that, and I saw his tomb. But there's a lot more stuff about the work Herod did. There are all kinds of archaeological stuff. And then they found a Galilean boat. There's a whole museum with this in Israel. But they were out on the beach one day in the Sea of Galilee, and they found this in the sediment there. It was so delicate. It was it was buried, but they had to delicately get it out of there. It took forever, and they had to spray all these chemicals on it to preserve it. But it's basically the same size of a fishing boat at the time of Jesus. Now, I don't know whether that's the boat Jesus was in. There's a lot of fishing boats, but that would be the leftovers of a fishing boat, the kind of fishing boats that were talked about in the Gospels. Then we had the Pilate inscription. This is the guy that wore Jesus' crucifixion, as you know. They found the Pilate inscription with his name on it. That he was the same guy that lived at the time of Jesus. They found this slab with his name on it. Okay. So that's interesting. And then I saw this. I was right there, standing right there when I was in Israel. They were doing excavations, even more excavations than I was there right as we were there. It looks a little different today. But this is the actual pool that when Jesus healed the blind man in John chapter 9, he told him to go down to the pool and wash his face. Or, that was the pool. That's where it would be located. Okay. And they have found the remains, like the whole thing. It's fascinating. So I was there, standing right there, but it was underneath a parking lot. They found it in Israel. Then they may have found the remains of Peter's house. Possibly, I don't know how determined that is, but there was words scratched on the wall that they think it was Peter's house. There's this 4th century synagogue that was built over it earlier. Then this guy, he's mentioned in the Bible a lot. We have all kinds of coins bearing his image with inscriptions. Obviously, he was a huge figure at that time. So plenty remains for him, plenty of coinage. And then we have all kinds of other figures and coins that have been found to confirm them as real people. So the New Testament is history, and the whole Bible's history, but there's tons of archaeological evidence for the New Testament. Now, that doesn't, you have to combine this with the other stuff too. You can't just isolate it. Okay. You have to combine this argument with the other arguments. All right, what about number 7? What do non-Christian sources report? Are there sources that confirm or are consistent with the teachings of the New Testament? Are there sources that challenge the New Testament reports? If non-Christian sources corroborate claims of the New Testament, this would seem to add. So the question is there anything outside the New Testament tells us about Jesus? Like, is there anything significant? Well, the first thing is there's not going to be a ton because a lot of people didn't care about Jesus. The Romans didn't care about Jesus. They didn't care about Jews really at all. They thought Jews were superstitious. So you're not going to find a ton of Roman writings about Jesus. There is some stuff like you have. This is a book you should get on if you want to go deeper on it. Jesus Outside the New Testament. That's a great book. But we have in the writings of Josephus, he was a Jewish historian at the time of Jesus, and you should get Paul Meyer's book on Josephus. Some of Josephus's stuff, it's not trustworthy, like some of the things that are in it. But there is stuff in it that is trustworthy. And the translation of a guy that Shlomo Pines did, an Arabic version of Josephus, the Arabic, it does seem to indicate that that's the authentic. And it's present in all the Greek manuscripts of Josephus. I'm sorry. That Josephus said at this time, this is what he says. In Antiquities 1863, this is in the writings of Josephus. He says, at this time, there's a wise man called Jesus. His conduct was good. He was known to be virtuous. Among many people, among the Jews and other nations, became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and die. But to those who become his disciples, did not abandon his discipleship. And that's pretty, as far as scholarship recognizes that much. So Josephus talked about Pilate condemned him to die, and he had disciples. You have also a couple other things in Josephus. You have 2 other writings where he confirms James, Jesus's brother, and then he also confirms the martyrdom of John the Baptist. Okay, so I'd say at the most we can trust Josephus to tell us about Jesus died. He had a brother named James. And he talked about John the Baptist. Okay, so that's something outside the New Testament, something. Then you had a guy named Tacitus, and he was a Roman leader, but he wrote a book. He wrote something about the early Christians. It's been translated here from the Latin by Robert Van Roost. Roost, the guy that wrote that book I just showed you. But he wrote something about there was something that broke out in the city of Rome. There was fires and there was all kinds of commotion, and the emperor blamed it on the early Christians. He blamed it on Jesus's followers. Okay, and so he says in the translation, the founder of this name Christ had been executed under the reign of Tiberius by Pilate. Suppressed for a time, the daily superstition erupted again, not only in Judea, the region of the sea, but also in the city of Rome, where all the things are horrible. So he records something about Jesus. That's another one. Those are probably 2 of the best ones that talk about anything about Jesus outside the New Testament. But overall, if you look at some of this, there's other stuff too, but I mean, they're okay. I wouldn't say they're rock solid, but there's some other things you could read about Jesus outside the New Testament. But the consensus is these documents or anything written about Jesus outside the New Testament was kind of summarized by F.F. Bruce, because there's something, Pliny the Younger is another one I didn't mention, but the consensus is that these documents tell that Jesus was from Nazareth. He lived a virtuous life. He performed unusual feats. He introduced a new teaching. He was crucified under Pilate. His disciples believe he rose from the dead. His disciples denied polytheism. Disciples worshipped him. His followers believed they were immortal. His followers had contempt for death. His followers renounced material goods. So those are some of the basics, but overall, I still think the New Testament is the best source for Jesus. So people looking for stuff outside the New Testament, it's okay. Nothing like just shattering, but it's okay. Now, here's a good one. Ben mentions this one, which I kind of like. He says there's something called spiritual and life transformation. He says, is there evidence of lives transformed in a manner consistent with the New Testament teachings? He says, in other words, if New Testament reports about Jesus' life and actions are true, along with the teachings of the early church, we expect to find lives transformed. So what he's saying is that if the New Testament's true, we should see the impact on history, should see the impact on people's lives. Now, it's true that if you talk to Mormons or Muslims, they will tell you that the Book of Mormon or the Quran has changed their life. I've had Mormons and Muslims tell me that. So that's not going to be the only argument you can use. That's not like something, just because a book makes an impact, that means it's true. Because obviously the Book of Mormon's false and the Quran's false. Okay, but it seems to have had an impact on some people's lives. Okay, so you'd only be allowed to use this argument if you combine it with other things. But if the New Testament's true, then yes, it's impacted a lot of lives. Obviously, we know the lives have been transformed. People have turned from sin, they've come to know Jesus, their lives have been radically transformed. But the argument we have is that the events in the New Testament have good backing, good evidence behind them that's really talking about truthful things, right? Whereas the Book of Mormon and the Quran are talking about a lot of false things that never really happened. So we have better evidence for the New Testament than we do for the Quran or the Book of Mormon. So if it is really true and these events really happen, then it should have an impact on people's lives. It certainly does. But like I said, you can't use this argument alone. You've got to combine it with other things. Now, there's another argument he uses, a couple more. He calls it non-canonical Christian sources. And in this one, he's asking if we have anything after the time of Jesus that are not in the New Testament that report kind of the same thing about Jesus. You know, do we have anything reported about you? Not like Josephus and those other things. These are written about people that were professing Christians that came along after Jesus, came along after the New Testament was written, but they basically confirm what the New Testament teaches. Okay. So it's like the teaching was consistent as time went on. And you do have that. You have some writings. You have what's a guy named Ignatius. He lived from 50 to 110 CE. Said, he said that there is he traced everything back to the apostles. He said that he actually was a bishop in Antioch. I'm sorry, where Peter and Paul probably spent some time. But he wrote some things about the New Testament, and they're obviously they're matching what the New Testament says. He's considered like in the apostolic going. His stuff is lining up with the apostles. And then you have First Clement. Clement was what we call one of the apostolic fathers. Okay, that's a title given to Christians who personally knew the apostles. Okay, they had a direct relationship with the apostles. And he said Peter and Paul were martyred. First Clement, he wrote that around 97 AD. He records that Peter and Paul were martyred. And then you have Polycarp. He was another apostolic father, and he knew the apostle John. And he wrote a letter to the church in Philippi. That's the only one that remains. But there's pretty good evidence that he did have a close relationship with the apostle John, Polycarp. So there's some writings, so these guys write things about things in the New Testament. There is some stuff there as time went on that confirmed the New Testament. I don't know, it's kind of interesting. And then finally, we have what's called the minimal facts. And, thing you got to understand, what got the New Testament going and what got Christianity going was the resurrection. And so an event is what got our faith going. The event was Jesus's death and resurrection. So what the minimal facts argument is, it basically says, are there certain things that all scholars agree on, whether they be skeptical, whether they be not even Christians, they could be Jewish, they could be agnostics. Um, just some facts about Jesus they all agree on, about the historical life of Jesus. And they don't, they may not agree what the explanation is for these facts, but they all agree on some facts. And these are the facts they agree on. They believe, even including skeptics, like Bart Ehrman agrees with this, they believe Jesus was crucified. Not a lot of debate on that. They believe Jesus' followers sincerely believed he rose from the dead. They think Jesus' followers thought he really rose from the dead. Not a lot of debate on that. Now, also, they agree that the testimony of Jesus' resurrection was very early. They started to record this very early. They believe that Jesus, his brother James, came to faith, and they believe Paul as well came to faith. He was a persecutor, but he came to faith. So when they're talking about the minimal facts, they're saying these are the facts that they agree on, no matter what their background is. Jesus died. His followers thought he rose from the dead. It was preached very early, and then James and Paul came to faith. Now, they may not agree on what caused this, okay? They are not saying the minimal facts prove Jesus rose from the dead. But what we're saying as Christians, as believers, okay, we're saying the best explanation for those minimal facts is the resurrection of Jesus. Okay, his resurrection explains why, why the followers thought he rose from the dead, why they proclaimed it. His actual resurrection explains what happened to James and Paul and why they proclaimed it very early on. Some scholars are just skeptical. Some scholars come up with some other explanation, but then there's a ton of scholars that think that Jesus' resurrection is the best explanation for that. Okay. So when you explain these minimal facts, you've got to be able to explain why they believe this. Now, I don't have time to do that. I've done that in other clips, explain why they hold to these 5 things. There's good reasons why they all believe these things. There's good evidence Jesus died. There's no reason to doubt his disciples sincerely believed he rose from the dead. And there's good enough evidence for early eyewitness testimony. I talked about Paul's letters as early. There's good reasons to believe James was converted. And of course, there's a lot of evidence that Paul came to faith. We just think the resurrection explains those things better than anything else. Okay? So those are 10 things to think about when it comes to the reliability of the New Testament. There's a whole lot more. But, just to get you started, if you want to get Ben's book, like I said, he has 13 points. But hopefully that's enough for now. So I shall stop and we can discuss.